Billionaire rushed to hospital to visit his sick daughter. And he's shocked by his fiancée's actions. Charles Beckett pushed open the hospital room door where his daughter lay, and what he saw in that instant would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had not planned to arrive at that hour. His daughter Sophie, only 14 years old, had been admitted 3 days earlier due to severe asthma complications. The doctors had assured him that her condition was stable, that she simply needed a few more days of observation. That morning, Charles had held her hand and promised he would return after an important meeting at the company headquarters. Lena, his fiancée, had volunteered to stay behind and look after Sophie. She smiled and told him to go handle his work, that she would be there, that the girl needed someone by her side. Charles had intended to come back in the early evening, but when his meeting ended sooner than expected, he stopped by the familiar flower shop on the corner of Tremont Street and picked out a bouquet of white tulips, Sophie's favorite. A warm, grateful, almost weightless feeling filled him. After all the loss after the death of his wife, he had finally begun to feel happiness returning to his life. That was what he believed. Boston General Hospital at midday was quiet. Autumn sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, casting long golden streaks across the corridor that led to the ICU, room 312. He walked with a heart full of love, carrying flowers and hope. But the moment his hand touched the doorknob, everything inside him seemed to freeze. The door was slightly ajar, and what he saw on the other side was beyond imagining. Sophie was convulsing her body, seizing limbs, thrashing against the rails of the hospital bed. The IV line was pulled askew, alarms flashing on the monitors in frantic bursts, and Lena, the woman he was going to marry, was standing beside the bed with a look of overwhelming tension carved deep into her face. One hand was pressed down firmly on Sophie's shoulder, trying to keep the little girl still, while the other held an unmarked syringe, hurriedly injecting a clear liquid into the IV port. Sophie was thrashing violently, her eyes rolling back her body, reacting with fierce convulsions as if her system was going into shock. The instant Charles pushed the door open, Lena jolted. Her hand trembled. In one swift, practiced motion, she withdrew the syringe and slipped it into the pocket of her long coat. She moved so fast that had Charles blinked, he might have missed it entirely. For the first few seconds, he couldn't breathe. Time shattered. He lunged forward, the bouquet falling from his hand and scattering across the floor. He grabbed Lena and pulled her away from the bed, his voice rising in a broken roar. "What did you just inject into her?" Lena stepped back, panic flashing in her eyes, but she did not produce the syringe. She stammered that Sophie had started seizing, that she was only trying to fix a blocked IV line. But Charles had seen the glint of metal, the unmistakable flash of a needle. And Sophie, though half-conscious, was staring up at Lena with a terror so raw, so visceral, that it hollowed out the room. It was the look of someone who knew without question that whatever had just entered her veins was not medicine a doctor would ever approve. But Sophie, though barely conscious, struggled to lift herself away from the pillow, her eyes wide with fear, flooded with tears and desperation. A nurse rushed in, followed closely by the attending physician. Chaos erupted around them, but for Charles, the world had already collapsed in that moment. The woman he loved, the one he had trusted with his heart and with the life of his only child, might have just tried to kill her. And worse still, he feared this may not have been the first time. If you're still with us at this point, perhaps like Charles, you're beginning to sense that something deeply wrong is lurking just beneath the seemingly perfect surface of a relationship. This story is only beginning, and there are twists ahead that even Charles himself cannot yet foresee. But before we continue with the next part, I'd like to ask you to take a brief moment to do something small yet meaningful. Please consider subscribing to Emotional Echoes, hit the like button, and share this video if you feel that the story has stirred something deep within you. Every time you share, you help us bring more heartfelt stories to those who may need a gentle reminder that human emotion still matters. And tell us where you're listening from. Comment the name of your city or country so we know that Charles and Sophie's journey is reaching hearts all around the world. Thank you for being here. And now let's continue with the next chapter. Lena's eyes flew wide when Charles yanked her away from the hospital bed. But what he saw in them was not the shock of someone innocent, not the instinctive terror of a person caught in the middle of a tragic misunderstanding. There was no true surprise in that gaze. What flickered there was cold and fractured, the kind of look that measures damage, calculates consequences rather than reacts from the heart. Charles saw it clearly. In a fraction of a second he wished he could unsee. If she had truly done nothing wrong, she would have screamed, stumbled backward in panic, or frantically tried to explain. But Lena simply stood there, her hands trembling in a way that felt practiced, the tears on her cheeks falling like they had been summoned on cue. As nurses and doctors rushed to Sophie's side, Charles remained frozen just feet away, his heart pounding so violently it felt as though the blood was draining from his chest. Lena stepped closer, grasped the sleeve of his coat, her voice catching in her throat. "I'm sorry, Charles. I really am. I don't know what happened. She was coughing so hard I thought she was choking. I was just trying to keep her still. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Charles looked into her tear-streaked face. It was the same voice, the same gentle softness that once made him believe he could love again after years of sealing off his heart. But now everything about it sounded wrong, like a melody just slightly off-key. Nothing fit with what he had just witnessed. And Charles was not a man easily given to doubt, not the type to jump to conclusions or see shadows where none existed. He ran a global tech corporation, negotiated contracts worth billions every quarter. He was trained to read faces, to dissect language, to anticipate the motives behind every move. And what he saw in Lena did not reassure him. When the internal emergency team arrived to transfer Sophie to a higher-level care unit, Charles walked beside her, gripping her small hand as she clung to him. Sophie said nothing. Her face was pale, her eyes half closed, her mouth still working the flow of oxygen. But just before the elevator doors closed, Charles turned and saw Lena standing behind the glass. Her eyes were fixed on him. There was no smile, no look of remorse, just a blank, distant stare, a look not shaken by fear of losing him, but one that seemed to assess how much he might already know. After long hours sitting silently by Sophie's bedside, when she had finally stabilized and the doctor confirmed her condition was no longer life-threatening, Charles stepped out into the hallway and let his head fall against the wall. The images played over and over in his mind, the pillow clutched tight, the IV line tugged askew, and the way Lena turned to face him when he burst into the room. It wasn't surprise. It was preparedness. As if she had already imagined that exact moment, as if in her mind Charles had arrived 10 minutes too late, and if that had happened, Sophie might not have been alive. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. Charles didn't know what kind of truth he was stepping into, but a father's intuition told him this was not an accident. This was not just a violent coughing fit. This was the beginning of something far darker, something he had never been prepared to face. And it began with the eyes of the woman he once believed he would spend the rest of his life with. Charles sat alone in his car, his hand clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles had turned a stark, bloodless white. The ground-level parking lot at Boston General was nearly silent at this hour, lit only by the dim amber glow of overhead lights, casting faint reflections across the windshield, illuminating the contours of a face lost in a storm of emotion. He didn't start the engine. He didn't call anyone. He didn't cry. But in his mind, a single sentence echoed again and again, like a voice calling back from the void. My daughter could have died today. Not from illness, not from some tragic medical misfortune, but because of someone he had once believed would become the stepmother to that child. Charles was not a man easily shaken by emotion. Years in the tech industry had forged him into someone methodical, disciplined, precise in every move. But all of that now felt like a hollow shell. When he had seen Lena standing beside Sophie's hospital bed with a pillow in her hands, he wasn't the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. He was only a father who had nearly lost his only child to something he could never have imagined. He remembered those early days when Lena entered the lives of father and daughter. Everything had unfolded so naturally, almost too perfectly. Lena had been sweet, gentle, attentive to Sophie in a way that bordered on extraordinary. She bought children's books, learned to cook Sophie's favorite meals, listened patiently to stories about school and friends. Charles had believed after the crushing loss of his wife that perhaps this was the first time his heart had dared to open again. He had believed. At first even Sophie smiled. She had called Lena Miss L. But slowly something changed. Sophie grew quieter. She no longer smiled when Lena entered the room. She didn't look forward to her visits. There was a time just once when Charles had caught his daughter's eyes looking past Lena's shoulder, and the memory of that glance now chilled him to the bone. It was not the gaze of a child basking in love. It was the silent look of someone enduring something invisible to those who should have noticed. And he hadn't noticed, or worse, he had noticed and looked away, because he was lonely, because he wanted to believe he could begin again. But the price of that blind trust had nearly cost Sophie her life. Charles loosened his grip on the wheel, leaned back in his seat, and closed his eyes. He didn't know where to begin. He didn't know how to face Lena again or what he would say to his daughter when she woke up. But one thing he knew without doubt: everything had changed now. Trust, love, Sophie's sense of safety. All of it had been shaken to its core in a single afternoon, and he would not let it happen again, not to anyone, not under any circumstances. His daughter could have died today, and that would never, ever be allowed to happen again. That night, Charles did not sleep. He sat alone in the hotel room across from the hospital, where a soft stripe of yellow light spilled from Sophie's window across the cold wooden floor. The only movement in a space heavy with silence. His thoughts were a tangle of memories, unanswered questions, and a guilt pressing deep and constant on the left side of his chest. How had everything veered so far off course? How could the woman he once believed would become part of their family turn out to be the greatest threat to his daughter's life? Charles drew in a long breath, but even the air felt thick and heavy, no lighter than the storm in his mind. And then, like an old reel winding backwards, he found himself remembering that first night, the night he met Lena. It was December at a charity gala at the South Boston Convention Center. Charles was there as the keynote sponsor, partly out of social obligation, partly in the hope of making connections in the medical community to help support Sophie. She had just turned 12, and her chronic asthma had begun to show signs of deepening complications. Lena entered the frame of his life without announcement, without flair, no theatrics, no charm offensive. She was the communications director for a nonprofit in public health, with long, softly curled brown hair, a voice calm and resonant, and eyes that gave the impression of listening, not waiting to speak. They met by chance at the bar when Charles was trying to dodge another round of empty small talk. Lena didn't recognize him as the CEO of one of the region's largest tech companies, which made the conversation easier, more honest. She spoke of her past as an elementary school teacher, then her decision to transition into community health in hopes of making a broader impact. When Charles mentioned his daughter and Sophie's condition, Lena's expression didn't shift to pity. She didn't offer hollow comfort. Instead, she asked what kinds of books Sophie liked to read. And then they really talked about children's stories, about the kind of little novels that help a young mind feel stronger in a world that often feels too big, too uncertain. After that evening, Charles didn't call her. It wasn't in his nature to open up quickly, and he especially didn't want to risk letting someone into Sophie's already fragile world. But Lena sent an email. A simple thank you along with a link to an article on psychological care for children with chronic illness. A small gesture, but one that felt intentional, sincere. 2 weeks later, they met again, this time over coffee in Beacon Hill. Charles laughed more than he expected, and more importantly, he didn't feel guilty for it. Sophie met Lena for the first time on a rainy afternoon when Lena showed up with a box of homemade cupcakes. There was no awkwardness, no performance. Lena sat cross-legged on the floor playing puzzles with Sophie. When the girl coughed, she didn't pepper her with questions. She simply reached for a tissue, wordless and calm. After that visit, Sophie smiled. Charles had taken it as a sign. A quiet beginning in a world still littered with broken pieces. Things unfolded gently, slowly, not rushed. Shared dinners, short weekend outings, evenings spent reading in the hospital room. Sophie seemed to grow used to Lena's presence, and Charles began to imagine a future with her. A future where Lena was there for the holidays, for birthdays, for the private moments he hadn't dared to believe he might share again. And then, as naturally as the next step in a story that felt finally right, he proposed. A quiet spring evening after a simple dinner at home with Sophie already asleep and the air still enough for him to hear his own heartbeat. Lena said yes without hesitation. Charles couldn't remember exactly what he felt then. Joy, maybe relief, or maybe just the quiet belief that he was doing the right thing. All he knew was that in that moment it felt as though everything was beginning to return to its proper place. A perfect beginning in a world full of unresolved wounds. But what Charles could never have known was that sometimes perfection that arrives too easily is exactly what you should fear the most. And it was that seemingly flawless beginning that dulled his instincts, that pulled him and his daughter into a nightmare no one could have foreseen. As Charles looked back on the early months when Lena first entered the lives of him and his daughter, a quiet, unsettling truth began to take shape, one he had overlooked until now. Sophie had never voiced any objection. She had never said she disliked Lena, never displayed open hostility or pushed back in any way. And it was precisely that silence that had blinded him to the unease slowly growing in his daughter's heart. In his mind at the time, Sophie's quiet meant acceptance, maybe even approval. He had never considered that a 14-year-old girl, no matter how intelligent or sensitive, might hide her true feelings simply to keep her father happy. But now, with everything shattered, he understood. Silence does not always mean yes. Sometimes it's the only way a child knows how to protect herself when no one is listening. There were nights when Charles had to travel for work and Lena stayed behind to care for Sophie. Each time he called to check in, his daughter would respond with brief, clipped answers. "Everything's fine." He hadn't noticed the dryness in her voice. He simply thought she was tired. Once returning home earlier than expected, he found Sophie curled up on the sofa, eyes wide open, staring blankly into space. Lena had said she was sleepy, but Charles remembered that look with painful clarity. It wasn't the look of a child at ease. It was the gaze of someone alert, someone bracing. On another occasion, when he had suggested a birthday celebration for Sophie, Lena had offered to plan something upscale, a dinner at a fancy restaurant with classmates invited. Sophie only nodded slightly. But on the day of the party, she barely spoke. She sat at the table disengaged, as if trapped in a play she never auditioned for. Charles had assumed she was just shy, perhaps not used to crowds. But now he saw the truth behind those quiet gestures. Sophie hadn't spoken. But in her eyes, her posture, her prolonged silence, there were signals, wordless cries for help. And he, the one person who should have known her best, had not heard them. He'd been too focused on building a new version of family, too determined to fill in the empty spaces that loss had left behind, to realize that Sophie didn't need someone new if that presence made her feel unsafe. Lena had always shown up at the right moment, said the right things, done all the right acts. To adults, she was the image of thoughtfulness, dependability. But to a child as sensitive as Sophie, perhaps that perfection was the most terrifying thing of all. Because no one is that perfect unless something is being hidden. And Sophie, through her silence, may have tried to tell him exactly that, but he hadn't heard. Or more truthfully, he hadn't been willing to hear. Because the truth is something we often only recognize when it's already too late. Charles remembered that afternoon with aching clarity. The air had turned crisp early that year, and the backyard was blanketed with fallen maple leaves, a thin quilt of gold and red that lay across the stone path leading to the house. He had just returned from work, briefcase still in hand, and stepped into the kitchen to find Lena standing beside Sophie, leaning in to adjust the collar of the girl's wool sweater. It was such a small gesture, so ordinary. And yet what made Charles stop mid-step was Sophie's reaction. The girl flinched subtly but unmistakably, her shoulders tensing, her body pulling sharply away as if the touch had chilled her skin to the bone. Lena immediately laughed it off, saying something light about Sophie being sensitive to thick wool, then turned to fetch a mug of cocoa waiting on the counter. Sophie said nothing. She simply lowered her head, fingers interlaced beneath the table, her thumbs turning in slow, anxious circles. At the time, Charles had brushed it off. Just a fleeting moment, he told himself. Children react oddly sometimes, especially when they're not feeling well. But now, with the truth laid bare before him, he couldn't forget the way her body had recoiled. It wasn't the sweater. It wasn't the cold. It was Lena. That was the first time Charles had ever seen his daughter shrink away from the touch of the woman he trusted. And it was also the first time, though only for a breath, that something inside him whispered that something wasn't right. Still, he had folded that whisper away, tucked it into some quiet drawer in the back of his mind. He had wanted to protect what he thought they had. A warm home, a nurturing partner, a family that seemed at long last to be mending. But now he knew that tiny moment had been the first toll of the warning bell, and he had ignored it, not because he hadn't seen, but because he hadn't dared to believe. It wasn't until the truth exploded into the sterile white of the hospital room, when Sophie came terrifyingly close to never breathing again, that Charles finally understood. That startled flinch on that chilly afternoon hadn't been mere reflex. It had been fear. A fear that had grown silently day by day right before his eyes. Charles hadn't slept a moment that night. He remained in the hospital room sitting beside Sophie, his hand gently wrapped around hers, the IV line snaking down from her small wrist. The shock had not eased. It lived in his chest like a second heartbeat, heavy and relentless. The image of Lena standing with that pillow, the flat, emotionless stare in her eyes, the dull reaction she gave when he had pulled her away, it played over and over in his mind like a warped reel, jagged and skipping. There was something too clear and yet maddeningly unclear about it all, something that wrapped itself around him like fog and refused to let go. At first light, when the doctor came in for Sophie's morning checkup, Charles quietly slipped out of the room and walked directly to the hospital's security office. He asked to speak with whoever handled internal investigations. At first, they gave him protocol. There might have been a misunderstanding, they said. Without hard evidence, they explained it would be difficult to take further action. But Charles wasn't the kind of man to be slowed down by caution or red tape. He left his card and firmly requested access to anyone with the authority to review the last 24 hours of surveillance footage and visitor logs from the ICU. 3 hours later, a woman entered the waiting room where Charles sat alone. She wore a deep blue shirt, hair pinned back tightly, a thin folder in hand. Her introduction was brief. Naomi Ruiz, special investigator with the city's hospital safety division. She had the bearing of someone who had seen too much darkness to be swayed by polite explanations. Charles rose to shake her hand and looked into her eyes. There was no softness there, no doubt, no distraction, only focus. He told her everything from the moment he walked into the room to the arrival of the nurses. When he finished, Ruiz sat quietly for a long moment, her fingers interlocked in front of her. She asked only one question. "Are you certain of what you saw?" Charles nodded without hesitation. Not just because he trusted his memory, but because he knew in the way a father knows when his child is in danger. He had seen something no one could misinterpret. Ruiz opened the folder and explained that while ICU cameras don't record inside the rooms for privacy reasons, the hallway footage and visitor logs could sometimes tell more than expected. And then she said something that made the air feel colder. There was a Beckett signature logged 20 minutes before Charles arrived, a visit that Charles himself did not make, and no one else in his family had come to the hospital that morning. She looked up at him again, her voice steady but deliberate. "I don't believe in coincidence. Someone signed in under your last name on the very day your daughter nearly lost her life and then vanished without anyone remembering their face. No camera caught them at the front desk. None of the nurses could say for sure who it was. But there is one thing we can confirm: Lena was in the room at that exact time." Charles felt a cold ripple run down his spine. This wasn't a spontaneous act, not a moment of panic or loss of control. Behind Lena's blank stare may have been something much more calculated. And if Ruiz was right, someone may have helped. Or worse, someone else might have been orchestrating the entire thing. For the first time, Charles felt a doubt that reached deeper than any one person. It wasn't just Lena he was unsure of now. It was the very foundation of everything he thought he knew. Ruiz leaned in slightly and added, "We'll investigate further, but if you truly want to know what's going on here, you should prepare yourself. Because what you're about to uncover may tear apart everything you've ever believed." Charles said nothing. He only nodded, his gaze drifting toward the window of the hospital room where Sophie still lay quiet and still on the other side of the glass. There was no room left in him for grief. Only one thing remained: the truth. And he would follow it to the very end. 3 days after his conversation with Detective Ruiz, Charles received a call just before 8 in the morning while sitting beside Sophie's hospital bed quietly reading the newspaper. Sophie was still weak, her sleep light and restless, but her vital signs had begun to stabilize. When he saw Naomi Ruiz's name flash across the screen, Charles immediately rose and stepped into the hallway. Her voice was direct. "Can you be at the city's investigative office within the hour? I have something you need to see." 90 minutes later, Charles was seated in a small meeting room on the 4th floor of the city administration building, across from Ruiz and another man who introduced himself as a hospital data analyst. On the table sat a thick folder of printed documents next to an open laptop displaying the internal access logs of Boston General's electronic medical system. Ruiz didn't waste time. "We reviewed all access to Sophie's medical records from the past 10 days, she said. There were a few out-of-hours entries made using an internal account under the name R. Beckett. Charles stiffened his eyes, narrowing at the mention of that familiar surname. Ruiz nodded, then added, The strange part is this account belongs to a former employee. She left the hospital nearly a year ago. Her access should have been deactivated long ago, but due to either technical oversight or negligence, the credentials remained active. Her name is Rachel Beckett. She used to work in the medical records department. There's no indication that she has a direct connection to Lena. But the timing of her access raises serious questions. The first login happened 3 days before Sophie was admitted. The second occurred just hours before the incident in the hospital room. Heat rose across Charles's face. He had never heard of Rachel Beckett. Lena had never once mentioned the name. But if someone had quietly accessed his daughter's medical file, this was no coincidence. Ruiz turned to another page and slid it across the table toward him. It was a copy of Sophie's treatment authorization form. In the section listing secondary guardians, there was a signature Lena's written clearly under the next of kin field. Charles stared at the line unmoving. He had never authorized Lena to sign any medical documents on his behalf. In every hospital visit, whether he was in town away on business or tied up in meetings, he had always dealt directly with the doctors himself. And yet here it was a signature complete with an internal patient ID code. He looked up, voice hoarse. Who gave her permission to do this? Ruiz didn't answer directly. She said, someone in the hospital may have been bribed, or she might have obtained the information from another source. But this was not a spontaneous act. Charles clenched his fist. The puzzle pieces were coming into view, but they weren't forming the picture he once believed in. A woman had accessed his daughter's private records through a dormant account. A signature had been falsified on legal hospital documents. An incident had taken place in a room where cameras didn't reach, and the woman he once loved was at the center of it all. Ruiz met his eyes, her voice low and steady. You were right. This wasn't an accident. Someone is trying to control this, every part of it, and Lena may not be working alone. She might just be one part of something larger. If that's the case, then what we're looking at is a plan that's been in motion for quite some time. Charles fell silent. The anger in him, once hot and immediate, now gave way to something colder, something deeper. Fear. Not the fear of nearly losing his daughter, but a fear rooted in the realization that both he and Sophie may have been targets all along, caught in the web of something calculated, far-reaching and colder than anything he had ever faced in his life. That afternoon, just as Charles was leaving the city investigative office, his phone buzzed with a short message from Detective Ruiz. Meet me on the second floor internal surveillance room. Someone needs to speak with you. He didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he turned his car back toward the city building and made his way inside. When he entered the room, he found a middle-aged man waiting dressed in a security jacket from the hospital. The man looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes and the worn expression of someone who hadn't slept in days. Ruiz gestured to him and said, "This is Tom Howard." He was the front desk officer in charge of the ICU the day of the incident. Charles nodded, eyes locked on the man, hoping desperately for something clearer, something that could help pierce through the fog settling over his life. Tom hesitated, his voice low and raspy. "I don't remember her face clearly. It was a busy day, but I do remember a young woman coming into the ICU around 11 in the morning. She didn't have a badge, but she was so confident I assumed she was family. I asked for her name and she just said, 'I'm Beckett.'" Charles froze, that name again echoing in his mind like a cold, sharp whisper, now more like a warning than a coincidence. Tom went on. "I asked who she was visiting, and she said the daughter of Charles Beckett. When I asked for the patient's full name, she didn't answer right away. She just said, 'the girl in room 312. I checked the chart. Sophie Beckett was in that room. Everything matched, so I let her in. I didn't think anything of it. The system had Lena listed as someone authorized for access. I figured she might be a relative, a cousin, maybe a sister. I'm sorry." Charles didn't respond. His throat tightened, but not from anger at the man in front of him. This wasn't about misplaced blame. It was something far more tangled. That woman, the one who claimed the name Beckett, who was she? Was it Rachel Beckett? Or someone else using his surname to slip past the hospital's safeguards? Ruiz sat silently, her eyes darting with the speed of someone connecting hidden threads in real time. Then she turned to Charles and asked softly, "Do you know anyone in Lena's family with the last name Beckett?" Charles slowly shook his head. No one. Lena had never mentioned any sisters or close relatives, and certainly not anyone with his name. Ruiz offered a possibility. "It's very likely she used your surname to mask her identity. It would have made the system more accepting. Staff more willing to let her through." But if it really was Rachel Beckett, then the question becomes, why did she still have access? How did she know which room Sophie was in? And most unsettling of all, why did she choose that name as her statement? Charles left the room with a weight in his chest heavier than anything he'd carried since this nightmare began. Something sharp and familiar stirred within him, but now it was darker, far more terrifying. It was the sensation of being watched, as if someone was always a step ahead, as if someone knew what he would do before he did it, knew where Sophie was, knew exactly how to infiltrate their lives without leaving a trace behind. He walked slowly toward the elevator, mind spiraling. He realized then, with a kind of quiet dread, that from this moment forward, no system could be trusted, no protocol could guarantee safety, not for his daughter, not for himself. Because if a stranger could walk into a hospital, use his name, and be granted full access to his child, then the world was not the place he thought it was. And Lena, the woman who once seemed so warm, so composed, might not be the one pulling the strings. She could be a pawn, just one face in something larger, something deeper, something colder than anything Charles had ever imagined, and whatever it was, he knew now it was coming for them. 3 days after the meeting with Tom Howard, as Charles sat quietly by Sophie's hospital bed, a nurse knocked gently at the door. In her hand was a plain white envelope, no return address, no official markings, only a short handwritten line on the front for Charles Beckett. The handwriting made him pause. There was something achingly familiar in the way the letters curved, tidy and deliberate, like someone trying to keep their composure one stroke at a time. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter more than 2 full pages long. The scent of fresh ink and crisp paper clung to it, as if it had been written only hours ago. At the top, a name appeared in small slanted script: Lena. Charles read it slowly, each word slicing deeper than the one before. I don't expect you to forgive me. I only hope you'll understand. I never meant to hurt Sophie, but things spiraled out of control long before you ever had a chance to see them. I lied to you, and I know that was wrong, but I didn't know what else to do when the truth was too big, too dangerous to say out loud. Charles paused, his hand trembling. The letter continued in a voice that was calm, despairing, and heartbreakingly real. Lena wrote that years ago, long before she met Charles, she had worked for a medical research organization with deep ties to a private pharmaceutical conglomerate. The organization didn't just conduct research, they ran clinical trials on vulnerable populations, including children with chronic illnesses. One of those trials failed disastrously. Children were harmed. Some suffered long-term immune damage. Lena had been the communications director during the time the scandal was buried, silenced through money, sealed by legal threats, erased by those with the power to rewrite facts. Afterward, Lena said she walked away. She changed her life completely, devoted herself to nonprofit work, tried to live as if that past had never happened. Then she met Charles. When she learned about Sophie's severe asthma, the frequent hospitalizations, the recurring complications, a terrible suspicion began to creep in. One of the children from the failed trials had symptoms eerily similar to Sophie's. And when Lena looked into Sophie's eyes, she said it felt like facing the weight of an old sin that had never been answered for. She couldn't be certain Sophie was one of the trial's victims, but she knew from experience how easily the healthcare system could be manipulated, how medical records could be altered, how children could disappear into the folds of data and be reduced to test results. She was afraid. Afraid that if she didn't keep Sophie within reach, someone else would harm her. Not her, but the people still out there, still erasing the past to protect themselves. I know you won't believe me, she wrote. I know what I've done has made forgiveness impossible, but I'd rather have you hate me than stand by and do nothing while that little girl dies. By the time Charles reached the final paragraph, his hand was slick with sweat. I was wrong to stay silent, but I needed to try to save what little is left of my own conscience. I won't contact you again. But if there's anything in you that still wants the truth, look at Sophie's medical records from the earliest years. You might find what you've never been told, and then you'll understand why all of this is happening. Lena. The letter fell into his lap. The hospital room was silent save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor beside Sophie. Inside Charles, a storm churned. The fury, the fear, the doubt, all of it lifted like shattered debris caught in a cyclone. If what Lena had written was true, then he and Sophie were not just the casualties of a relationship gone wrong. They were victims of something systematic, something hidden, something protected. And Lena, the woman he thought was a threat to his daughter, may have been the only one who had seen the danger coming. Perhaps Charles thought she wasn't running from guilt. Perhaps she was running toward redemption, and maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been looking in the wrong direction. He just hadn't dared to look deep enough. Charles sat motionless for a long time after finishing Lena's letter. Every word etched itself into his mind, stirring up fragments of memory he thought had long since faded. But it wasn't the confessions or even the plea for understanding that struck the hardest. It was a single name buried near the end of the letter, almost like a footnote. A name Lena said she had heard again and again during closed-door meetings back when she worked for that shadowy research organization. Evelyn Grant. The name didn't just sound familiar, it hit Charles like a sudden drop in altitude, because Evelyn Grant wasn't a stranger. She had once been part of the very chapter of his life he had tried hardest to bury. Nearly 2 decades ago, Evelyn had been a senior scientist in a joint initiative between government agencies and biotech corporations. At the time, Charles was young, still rising, invited to serve as a tech advisor for a national medical data infrastructure project. Evelyn wasn't just respected, she was feared. Brilliant, efficient, unflinching. But it wasn't her intelligence that left an impression on Charles. It was her disdain for ethical limits. He remembered a particular meeting in Chicago. Evelyn stood before the room, arguing fiercely in favor of experimental gene editing trials on chronically ill children. She said the long-term gains justified the discomfort, that waiting would only allow others less careful perhaps to take the lead. It wasn't just clinical detachment, it was belief. Conviction that science must be free, even if it meant crossing lines others would never touch. That meeting had been a breaking point. Some walked away from the project after that. Charles was one of them. He had no interest in a future built on data harvested from suffering children. Afterward, Evelyn's name all but vanished from the scientific community. No articles, no interviews, no conference appearances. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. But now her name had returned, resurfacing not through a peer-reviewed journal, but through the shaky handwriting of a woman who had nearly lost control in the shadow of a child nearly losing her life. A chill spread through Charles's spine. If Evelyn Grant was connected to the organization Lena had fled, if she was still pulling the strings, still quietly orchestrating something under the guise of medicine, then this wasn't a domestic crisis. It was the edge of something much larger. A quiet storm that he and Sophie had just begun to touch. He left immediately, returning to the hospital with urgency pressing behind every step. Back in Sophie's room, he powered on his laptop and began combing through her medical history. He pulled up files from as early as her first hospitalizations. Test results, referrals, blood work, genetic screening reports, every scrap of data gathered across years of treatment. And there, hidden in an obscure note attached to a routine gene analysis performed when Sophie was 7, during a referral to a specialized research center affiliated with Boston General, he saw it. A name listed under primary lab analyst, Evelyn Grant. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a ghost. It was the past rising like smoke from something never extinguished. Charles stared at the screen, his heart pounding with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. Now he understood. This wasn't just a medical error. It wasn't a caregiver gone too far. It wasn't even a conspiracy born of desperation. This was the visible tip of something vast, deliberate, and buried, an operation decades in the making. And he, the man who once turned away from unethical science, was now being pulled back into its orbit, not for glory, not for power, but to protect the one life that had never been given a choice. His daughter, Sophie. Charles didn't look away from the screen for nearly an hour after seeing Evelyn Grant's name appear in Sophie's test records. The deeper he dug into the data, the more he realized that everything he thought he knew about his daughter's medical history, every procedure, every explanation, every reassuring word was only the visible tip of something vast and meticulously hidden. There were test forms that didn't appear in any official patient file, marked instead with cryptic internal codes. There were unexplained transfers between departments late at night, vaguely labeled as advanced monitoring. Most alarming of all, in one immunological report from when Sophie was 8, the supervising physician's signature belonged to someone who didn't appear on the staff roster of any hospital Charles had ever worked with. The name was untraceable, detached, ghost-like. It dawned on him slowly but unmistakably that he and his daughter had never been just a family navigating the ordinary complexities of chronic illness. They had been observed, accessed, possibly even manipulated by forces no one had ever spoken aloud. He thought back to the moments when Sophie had suddenly weakened after certain treatments, when no one could give a clear explanation for her symptoms. The days she cried from headaches, insomnia, hair falling out in tiny clumps, even though she never ran a fever. The doctors had always reassured him. These were side effects, normal responses to medication. Everything was under control, and Charles had believed them. Because he wanted to believe. But now every one of those words rang hollow like echoes in an empty room. He leaned back slowly in his chair, spine pressing into the frame, his mind like a table scattered with puzzle pieces turned upside down. And only now, with the reappearance of Evelyn Grant's name, did he begin to see the shape they were forming. A system built not to heal but to study, a network no longer medical but mechanical in its cold precision. Children like Sophie turned into data points in silent, unauthorized trials. And Lena, mysterious, cautious, erratic Lena, had been the only one to leave him a map. Her letter was no longer a plea for forgiveness. It was the first breadcrumb leading him toward a greater truth. A truth that made clear this was never just about protecting Sophie from one woman's intentions. It was about pulling her out from the grasp of an entire institution that had quietly been following them, intervening in ways no one had dared to admit. Charles closed his eyes and exhaled the air, leaving him slowly, heavily. Something was shifting inside him, not fear, not rage, but resolve. This was bigger than he had ever imagined, but now he saw it for what it was. And he was ready. For Sophie, for the truth, and for the other children hidden somewhere in this system who had never even been given a choice. Charles stayed awake the entire night. He sat alone in the quiet hospital room, the only sound the steady rhythmic beep of Sophie's heart monitor, each tone landing like a slow, deliberate tick of a clock counting down. On the table beside him, her medical files lay scattered, each page a sliver of a past he had once believed he understood. But now, after all he had read, after every thread had been pulled and each silent detail placed into its rightful context, Charles was forced to face something his heart had long resisted. Sophie had been part of a clinical trial. His daughter, the child he loved beyond all reason, had been used in a medical experiment without ever being told, without consent, without choice. All of it buried beneath carefully crafted data disguised in lab reports, sugar-coated in the gentle reassurances of doctors who wore their white coats like armor. And he who had always seen himself as cautious, as vigilant as a father who paid attention, had seen nothing. Not once. He remembered when Sophie was 6. She had been hospitalized for nearly 2 weeks after a prolonged asthma attack. A new treatment plan had been offered, then one the doctor described as promising with high success rates in boosting respiratory immunity for children. Charles had signed the consent forms without hesitation, believing wholeheartedly that he was doing what was best for his daughter. No one told him the drug had not yet been approved by the FDA. No one mentioned it was part of a clinical trial managed by a private research entity connected to Evelyn Grant. And certainly no one said the results of the trial would be sent to an isolated data center kept off the record, hidden from public oversight. Charles felt his throat tighten. Not because he'd been deceived, but because he hadn't known. He had trusted the system. Trusted the hospital's reputation, the doctor's degrees, the idea of medical ethics. He had never imagined that a child could be turned into a data point while her father stood by, believing he was doing everything right. Now it was all too clear. The unexplained fatigue, the recurring migraines, the medications whose names never appeared on her official prescriptions. All signs, and he had ignored them. Because he had wanted to believe. Because he had wanted so badly to be a good father that he dared not question the men and women in white coats. And in doing so, he had allowed Sophie to become a victim. Charles pressed a hand to his forehead, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. But he knew guilt couldn't save his daughter. Shame couldn't rewrite the past. The only thing left now was to act, to follow the truth to its source, to uncover who had orchestrated all of this, and to protect Sophie no matter the cost. He stood slowly, walked to her bedside, and looked down at the small face now resting in sleep after days of chaos. He reached for her hand, so small, so fragile, and held it gently. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he made a promise. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner, but from now on, no one touches you. No doctors, no researchers, no one. Not ever again." Sophie had been a test subject, and he had been a man who believed too blindly in a system designed to keep people compliant. But from this moment forward, he would not be that man again. And this fight, this war for his daughter's truth, would be his. Charles began digging into the name Evelyn Grant the very next morning. He no longer had the patience to wait for formal investigations or institutional protocol. For him, time had become something he could no longer afford to waste. Sophie was recovering, yes, but recovery meant nothing if the people behind all this could return. Last time it was a pillow in a hospital room. Next time it could be something quieter, something invisible. And this time he had to be ahead. Charles reached out to an old friend, someone he had worked with years ago during a collaborative project on national patient record systems, a man who had once lived inside the architecture of medical data. Through a series of encrypted calls and cautious exchanges, Charles was granted access to a legacy database, one that contained records from shuttered research programs long buried beneath bureaucratic silence. And there, like a beacon glowing in the dark, the name Evelyn Grant surfaced again, clear, bold, unmistakable. She had once led a program known internally as the Horizon Protocol. Publicly, it was branded as a progressive healthcare initiative for genetically at-risk children. The language in the brochures spoke of innovation, of access, of hope. But the internal documents told a different story, one soaked in exploitation, precision, and silence. Horizon had conducted hundreds of unauthorized trials using unapproved biological compounds. Many of these trials drew data from pediatric patients without formal consent from their parents. Evelyn had built her career not just on hiding the truth, but on making the lie look legitimate. Every test was labeled as part of an extended study. Every report was cloaked in dense medical jargon, carefully curated to convince parents that their child was simply receiving cutting-edge care. But in reality, these were unregulated, unreviewed experiments, untested, unapproved, and never disclosed to the public. She had built an empire on the silent harm of those who couldn't speak. Children like Sophie. Parents like Charles. As he followed the money trail deeper, Charles uncovered a web of shell companies' subsidiaries hidden beneath a single healthcare investment fund based in Delaware. Each entity was designed to cycle capital erase fingerprints, obscure ownership. But when the layers were peeled back through dummy corporations, offshore accounts, anonymous filings, one name remained at the top: Evelyn Grant. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply stepped into the shadows. She was running everything from behind the veil, through spreadsheets and funding charts, through grants and anonymous white papers. She didn't need to touch a patient, didn't need to appear in a hospital corridor. All she had to do was build the system. Others would carry out the work. And the system had worked flawlessly for over a decade. Hundreds of children like Sophie had become anonymous entries in databases listed under codes, tagged by symptoms reduced to the blood markers and genetic quirks that made them desirable for experimentation. Their pain was just another line item. Charles closed the laptop, his chest heavy with something deeper than rage. It was clarity. Cold, clean, unforgiving clarity. Every new discovery only deepened the sense of how naive he had once been. But now, there was no turning back. He had seen the truth behind the curtain. Evelyn's empire was not made of steel and glass. It was built of silence, of broken trust, of children who were never given a voice, and adults who trusted the word science more than they trusted their own instincts. Now Charles knew. If he wanted to protect Sophie, if he wanted to expose Evelyn, if he wanted to stop this machine, he would have to step into its very core. Not as a father who had been broken, but as a man who had once stood in that world, and now saw it for what it really was. Down to the root. 2 days after Charles traced the financial web behind the Horizon Protocol and confirmed that Evelyn Grant stood at the very top of it, he received a strange call late in the evening. The number displayed no area code, just a series of digits that felt deliberately obscured. He hesitated for a few seconds, then picked up. A woman's voice came through, calm, clear, and unhurried. "Good evening, Mr. Beckett. I believe you've uncovered just enough to know where you should stop." Charles didn't reply. He gripped the phone tighter, his heartbeat sharp in his chest, but his voice remained steady. He wouldn't let fear find its way into the call. The woman continued. "I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling to propose something, a settlement. You stop digging. You refrain from sharing what you found with any agency, any journalist, anyone. And in return, Sophie will be transferred to a private international medical facility, world-class, highly specialized. She'll receive free lifetime care. Better than anything available in the United States. We will guarantee her safety." She paused, then added with practiced softness, "You'll also receive financial support, compensation for the emotional distress this has caused. Nothing public, no paper trail, just a discreet agreement between adults who understand how to protect what matters most." Charles felt his stomach tighten, not at the offer itself, but at the terrifying calm in her voice. There was no guilt, no apology, just negotiation, just business. A price for silence, a life reduced to terms and conditions. And what surprised him most in that moment was that he wasn't afraid. He wasn't shaken. He wasn't panicked. He didn't feel the walls closing in. What he felt was anger, slow, smoldering, resolute. Because someone somewhere believed everything could be bought. Even truth. Even lives. Even his daughter. He let a few seconds pass, then asked a single question voice even. "Is the person speaking to me right now Evelyn Grant?" The woman didn't miss a beat. "My name isn't important. What matters is that you understand going any further won't help Sophie. On the contrary, it may put both of you in greater danger." Charles gave a small, quiet laugh. It wasn't amusement, it was recognition. A laugh at himself, at the clarity that had come too late and the point of no return he had already crossed. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "If you ever understood what really matters to a father, you would never have made this call." And he hung up. In that moment, Charles knew he had closed the door on any possibility of compromise. He also knew the storm to come might be darker than anything yet faced. But inside, something lit up clearer than fear, stronger than doubt. Silence had never saved anyone. And if he didn't speak, didn't act. More children out, there would be reduced to numbers erased in the footnotes of research papers and buried beneath funded studies and anonymized data. And he would remain just another failed father who let it happen. And that was the one thing he would never, ever accept. Charles didn't sleep a single minute the night after that call. He knew the line had been crossed. When someone with power could contact him directly, cloak their intent in the language of what's best for your daughter, and present a deal as if it were mercy, it meant they had been watching him closely, perhaps for a long time. By morning, there was only one thing on his mind. He returned to the hospital not as a grieving father, not as a man lost in fear, but as someone stepping deliberately into the enemy's territory. He said nothing to the doctors, didn't ask for help from security. Instead, he moved through Sophie's hospital room with sharp, methodical focus. He examined everything: ceiling lights, picture frames, the oxygen console, even inside the plastic shell of the wall-mounted clock. He wasn't a surveillance expert, but decades in tech had taught him enough to recognize what didn't belong. And then behind the wheeled IV stand, tucked in a seam on the underside of the metal column, he saw it. A sliver-thin black circle embedded within a narrow groove. Not a camera. A microphone. Tiny, precision-made, and it had no place in any publicly funded hospital. Charles removed it with his bare hands, slipped it into his coat pocket, and sat back down beside his daughter just as she began to stir. Sophie opened her eyes, slowly clouded with fatigue, but holding a bit more life than the days before. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze and smiled, as if everything were normal. But inside, he knew from this moment forward, every word spoken in that room had to be calculated, measured, sparse. And yet what shook him most wasn't the device. It was what came later. Charles brought the mic to an old friend, someone in security tech, discreet and trusted. They took it apart together. And the findings were worse than he'd feared. The device wasn't just a microphone. It could be triggered remotely. It had been programmed to detect specific audio frequencies, keywords, voice patterns, tones of urgency. It was smart, sophisticated, the kind of tech that didn't belong to a rogue nurse or a suspicious fiancé. This was corporate level, intelligence level. And within the device's buffer, a brief sliver of data not yet transmitted was a saved audio fragment, 19 seconds long. Charles requested the file. When the audio played, something inside him snapped. Sophie's voice. Soft, weak, fading. "Don't let her in again. She hurts me. I don't want to see her anymore." Then came Lena's voice, gentle, sweet, chilling. "Shh, Sophie, be good. You have to trust me. I'm only trying to help you." Charles stared at the screen as if the words had etched themselves onto glass. He thought of the days he had been away, meetings, trips, calls, the times he trusted Lena to stay, the hours no one had questioned who came in or out of that room. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was that Sophie had known, had felt it, had pleaded, and no one heard her. No one listened. Charles clenched his hand into a fist. He couldn't change the past, but he could stop what came next. To do that, he needed to know exactly who and what he was up against. Evelyn wasn't just a scientist. She was a designer. The architect of a system where children like Sophie weren't patients, they were resources. Where rooms like Sophie's weren't sanctuaries, they were checkpoints in a network of control. But now Charles had seen the current flowing beneath the surface. And he knew if he was going to break it, it would have to be done in the open. Not through whispers, not in shadows. He would tear this system apart layer by layer, beginning with the smallest piece. A listening device. one barely visible dot, but inside it was a truth too large to ignore. Charles stepped into the small cafe in Brooklyn right on time. The place was quiet, holding only a few elderly patrons reading newspapers by the window, where warm yellow light spilled gently across worn pages and weary faces. In the corner of the room, Lena was already there waiting. She wore a long gray coat, her hair neatly tied back. Her face touched with light makeup, and her eyes remained as ever, the one thing Charles could never read. They didn't speak right away. For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other, as if something unnamed still hovered between them. Charles pulled out a chair, set down the coffee he had just purchased, and silently switched on the small recording device hidden in his coat pocket. It wasn't because he wanted to hurt Lena, but because he needed the truth. And he knew that without clear evidence, everything he suspected would only sound like the emotional ramblings of a desperate father. Lena studied him closely, then took a sip of her tea. Charles spoke first, his voice steady and low. "I found a listening device in Sophie's hospital room, planted inside the IV stand." Lena showed no reaction. She only nodded slightly, as if the revelation came as no surprise. She spoke slowly. "You think I put it there? You're not sure. But you want to know why. And you want me to be honest, Charles." She fell silent for a long moment, then lifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice was no longer soft. "You really think I don't know you're recording this conversation?" Charles didn't move, but his heart skipped a beat. Lena leaned back in her chair, offering a tired smile. "I've worked with some of the best in counterintelligence, Charles. You think I wouldn't notice you adjusting your coat pocket 3 times in under a minute? You expect me to confess everything so you can take it to court, so you can play the hero who saves his daughter while I become the scapegoat." Charles said nothing, but Lena went on, her voice now slicing through the air, each word deliberate. "You have no idea how deep this goes. I'm not the only one who knew Sophie was part of the research. She wasn't the only child. There is an entire system behind this, a network that if you shake it, will strike long before you can speak another word. You're not fighting me, Charles. You're fighting something you can't even begin to imagine." Charles clenched his hands beneath the table. Looking at the woman across from him, he saw that there was no cheap deceit in her eyes. What he saw instead was real fear. Not for herself, but for him. Lena leaned in, and her voice dropping. "You think I stayed with Sophie out of guilt? I stayed because I knew that if I stepped back, someone else would take my place. Someone you wouldn't be able to sit across from like this. Someone who, when they make a move, will leave no way back for Sophie." Charles didn't know how much of what she said he could believe. But he knew one thing. Lena was speaking like someone who had nothing left to lose. And when a woman like that begins to issue warnings, you don't ignore them. He stood up without another word. Before turning to leave, he looked at her one last time. "If you have anything else to say, now's the time." Lena said only one thing. "If you really want to save her, stop recording. Look deeper, and never believe you're ahead. Because to them, you're always one step behind." Charles stepped out of the cafe, the biting cold wind cutting through his collar. He didn't know who might be listening, didn't know what his next move should be. But he knew the game had shifted, and the pieces that seemed like pawns might just be the ones concealing an entire board. 3 days after his final meeting with Lena, Charles received an anonymous message containing only 2 lines and a single GPS coordinate. "If you want to know what Sophie went through, come here." The location pointed to an abandoned facility on the northern outskirts of New Jersey. Once a biological research institute, it had been shut down for nearly a decade. The rusted iron gate was unlocked, and inside hung the damp, stale scent of time forgotten. Charles brought with him a flashlight and a small camera. He had no idea what waited for him inside, but he knew this was no longer a moment to hesitate. Deep beneath the ground, behind a thick steel door that had taken Charles nearly 20 minutes to crack open with a specialized electronic lockpick kit, there lay a cold, lifeless server room. The air was heavy with the sharp tang of metal and the musty scent of long-settled dust. Most of the server racks had been stripped or smashed beyond repair, leaving jagged cables and twisted steel in their wake. But in the farthest corner, a cluster of old machines still blinked with faint signal lights. As if by some strange miracle, or perhaps by deliberate design, the backup power was still holding on. Charles wasn't looking for paper. He knew people like Evelyn Grant never left trails in ink. He opened his laptop and connected a cable to the server's access port. The screen came alive, black as night, spilling out lines of glowing green commands. In that moment, Charles returned to who he truly was, not a grieving father searching through the ruins of his past, but the legendary architect of code he once had been. The encryption was outdated but intricate beyond belief, crafted to self-destruct at the slightest misstep. Sweat beaded along his brow as his fingers flew across the keyboard with dizzying speed. He bypassed the firewall. He decrypted root access. "All right," he whispered. The screen flared. Thousands of data files spilled open like floodgates giving way. In a hidden folder labeled Nova Child, he found what he had come for. Not brittle papers or faded ink, but experiment log videos and real-time biometric tracking charts. And there, glowing against the darkness of the underground room, the name Sophie Beckett rose on the LED display, etched in light like a ghost refusing to be forgotten. The data mapped out in relentless detail the course of genetic alteration and the command sequences for experimental injections. He looked around the dark room, this place that once held secrets labeled as scientific research. But to him, what lay on those pages was not science. It was crime. Evelyn Grant could call it anything she wanted. Data, clinical trials, medical advancement. But when a child is made to suffer, when a parent is denied the truth of what is happening to their own daughter and why it ceases to be science, it becomes theft. It becomes betrayal. It becomes murder in the dark. Charles left the building as the sun began to slip behind the distant hills. In his hands were documents he knew could change everything. Not just for Sophie, but for the hundreds of children who had once received so-called special treatment and never heard a single answer. He drove back toward the city with a weight heavy in his chest, Lena's voice from the cafe echoing in his mind. To them, you're always one step behind. But now he no longer cared who came first, because he understood this fight was no longer about bringing down a scientist who had lost her conscience. It was about exposing an entire system that had trampled life in the name of science. And no matter who stood in his way, he would not back down. Because for him, this was not an investigation. This was retribution for his daughter, and for every child who never had the chance to speak their truth. When Charles returned to the hospital after his trip to New Jersey, he carried with him a small bag filled with documents that were not just evidence, but the weight of grief pressed into ink. The numbers, the charts, the clinical notes describing Sophie's condition pierced him like 1,000 needles each time his eyes met the page. He knew he was about to enter the hardest part, not the revealing of truth, but the confrontation with someone who had known it all along and chose silence instead. Lena wasn't in the hospital room when he arrived. She was standing on the 5th-floor balcony where the whole park below could be seen stretched out in fading afternoon light. Charles walked up behind her saying nothing. She didn't turn, as though she had known all along he was there. After a pause, her voice came soft but unflinching. "You found everything, didn't you?" Charles nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I found her name, the note Evelyn's signature, and the reports about the other children." Lena turned. Then her eyes rimmed with red, though no tears fell. "I wasn't there when Sophie was tested. By the time I was brought into the program, it had already begun. But I knew. I saw the results. And I chose to stay silent." Charles said nothing. He simply looked at her the way one might look at a person who had just stepped out of a fire smoke, still clinging to their hair and coat. Lena took a breath, her voice growing faint. "I told myself that if I stayed, I could protect Sophie, that maybe I could pull her out slowly without drawing attention. But I was wrong. I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't strong enough. And I didn't have the courage to speak up when it could have made a difference." Still, he remained silent. There was no judgment in his face and no forgiveness either. Only the long stillness between two people who once believed they could build a family together. At last, Lena reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a portable hard drive, all the internal data from the Horizon protocol, access codes, funding records, testing sites, patient names, everything. "I backed it up over the last 2 years. I don't know how much of it is still useful, but if you're going to take this further, you'll need it." Charles took the drive. His hands did not tremble, but there was a weight behind his eyes that spoke of everything he carried. Lena looked at him, her voice unsteady but clear. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm only asking you to do what I couldn't. Finish this, for Sophie, for the other children, and for yourself." Charles looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, he no longer saw the woman who had betrayed him, no longer saw the one who had once left him speechless with anger. He saw someone who had made mistakes, who had chosen wrong, but who was trying now to make something right with what little she had left. He nodded gently, then spoke only one sentence. "You don't need my forgiveness, but Sophie will need to know her mother did not stay silent." Then he turned and walked away. Not because he had forgotten, but because he was ready to carry both the fury and the grace, because sometimes mercy does not come from those who are most deserving, but from those who need it most. Lena did not deserve forgiveness, but that day she received one final kindness from the man she had wounded more deeply than anyone, and for her, that was enough to keep going. Charles sat alone in his study, the glow of his desk lamp casting a quiet light across stacks of documents, and the hard drives resting beside them, silent and weighty like unspoken truths. On the desk lay a copy of the legal complaint he was preparing to send to 3 federal agencies, accompanied by the evidence that exposed the Horizon Protocol, Evelyn Grant, and the long chain of buried violations hidden beneath the polished veneer of scientific research. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He knew the consequences would be immense, not just for those whose names would be dragged into the light, but also for himself and for Sophie. But tonight, among the schedules, the data, the names and numbers, the only image that filled his mind was the face of his little girl, fast asleep in her hospital room. Sophie had begun to recover. The fevers that once came without warning were now gone. Her eyes no longer flinched away when Lena entered the room. She had started drawing again, simple pictures but vivid, full of color and small, stubborn hope. One afternoon during a visit, Sophie handed him a drawing. In it were 2 people walking hand in hand across a bridge. One was tall, with gray-streaked hair. The other a little girl with dark brown hair holding a bright blue balloon. Above them, scrawled in crayon, were 3 words, "Daddy and me, forever." Charles held the drawing, unable to speak. For years he had believed his greatest achievement was the technology empire he built from nothing. Offices spread across state lines, contracts worth millions, invitations to speak before investors, to pose for press photos to explain the brilliance of the next innovation. He had once believed his worth lived in numbers, in algorithms, in ideas no one else could imagine. But now, with everything he had ever built on the verge of collapse because of his decision to speak the truth, he understood that none of it had ever really mattered. His empire had never lived in data charts or company earnings. It lived in the little girl who drew pictures in a hospital bed, in the fragile voice that called him Dad on days when they weren't sure she would see another morning, in the small hand that reached for his with absolute trust. That was the real empire, and he would not let anyone dismantle it again. Charles rose from his chair and walked out of the room, carrying the drawing and the legal documents with him. He didn't know what lay ahead. Perhaps a legal war that would last for years. Perhaps losses greater than he'd ever anticipated. But he knew one thing for certain. He had found what truly mattered in his life. And it did not exist on the floor of any stock exchange. It lived in the arms of a child who had once been broken. And he would fight for it until the very end, for Sophie, for the only empire that ever truly belonged to him. And for the belief that sometimes the truth is the most valuable thing a person can choose to protect. Since that turning point, Charles was no longer the man who had once devoted his entire life to building a tech empire admired by the world. He had stepped down from his executive position, withdrawn all his shares, and quietly disappeared from the spotlight he had chased for more than 2 decades. Now his days were filled with Sophie. He picked her up from school, brought her to therapy sessions, and spent hours with her in the park, just to listen, listening to her recount a strange dream or share a new idea for her next drawing. Charles had come to understand that the only thing truly worth protecting for the rest of his life was not the skyline of corporate towers or the million-dollar projects, but that small, bright smile. It was the pure heart and quiet trust of a child who had once been deeply hurt, but somehow still chose to love again. That was the only empire he would defend from now on. The story of Charles and Sophie may be fictional, but the emotions it stirs are deeply real. It reminds us that some values can't be measured in dollars, can't be bought with influence, and can't be preserved unless we first learn to love and protect the simplest, most human parts of life. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear your story from the quietest corners of your heart. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone close to you, and don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Echoes, where each day we bring you stories that gently echo through the heart. Thank you for watching to the very end. We wish you and your loved ones good health, a peaceful life, and the kind of days that feel full of meaning. Until next time, take care.